In the heart of the vast ocean lies a forgotten world, where once a powerful civilization flourished, Atlantis. Now, as its ancient ruins sink deeper into the sea, the whispers of its past echo through the waves. What happened to this lost city? Was it truly destroyed by the gods, or is there more to its fate than meets the eye? Join us as we drift into the dreamlike history of Atlantis, where myth and mystery intertwine, lulling you into the depths of slumber. Long before the ocean claimed the lands of Atlantis, there was a time when the sun shone brighter and the skies above were clearer. The island, known as the Jewel of the Seas, stood untouched by the hands of time, a paradise of immense beauty and unmatched prosperity. The soil was rich, the rivers flowed with crystal clear water, and the air was filled with the fragrance of blossoming flowers and sweet fruit. It was a land where dreams could come true, where the power of nature was in perfect harmony with the brilliance of its people. At the heart of this flourishing civilization was a city built not of stone but of gold, its streets paved with precious metals, and its buildings reaching high into the sky. The grand temples, dedicated to the gods of both the earth and the stars, shimmered in the sunlight, their marble walls adorned with intricate carvings of ancient wisdom. The people of Atlantis were known for their mastery over science and magic, combining both in a way no other civilization had ever dared to do. The island was ruled by King Atlas, a wise and just leader who guided his people with a firm hand and a kind heart. Under his reign, Atlantis prospered, and its people lived in harmony with each other and with the forces of nature. They harnessed the power of the elements, earth, wind, fire, and water, to fuel their great machines and to build wonders that seemed to defy the very laws of physics. But despite their greatness, the people of Atlantis were unaware of the impending storm that would soon wash over them. The gods, watching from above, whispered of a reckoning, a day when the balance would tip, and the splendor of Atlantis would be reduced to nothing but myth. And yet, at this moment, as the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars began to twinkle like jewels in the night sky, Atlantis was unaware of its fate. The island slept in peace, untouched by the forces that would soon alter the course of history forever. The story of Atlantis, with all its grandeur, had only just begun. As the stars sparkled brightly in the heavens above, the city of Atlantis pulsed with life. The people went about their daily tasks, their hearts full of ambition and their minds sharp with the knowledge passed down through generations. The streets echoed with the sounds of bustling markets, where traders from distant lands brought exotic spices, rare gemstones, and silks, finer than any seen elsewhere in the world. Music played softly in the background, blending with the gentle hum of the city's incredible energy. At the center of the city stood the great temple of Poseidon, the god of the sea, who was said to protect and guide the island. This magnificent structure, taller than any building in Atlantis, was an architectural marvel with towering columns and walls made of polished blue marble that reflected the shimmering waters surrounding the island. Inside the temple, priests and priestesses chanted ancient prayers, their voices reverberating through the halls in perfect harmony with the sea breeze. It was here, in the sacred heart of Atlantis, that the leaders of the city would meet to make decisions that would shape the future of their civilization. King Atlas, regal and poised, would sit in the grand throne room, surrounded by his counselors, scholars, and oracles. The city's magic, technology, and wisdom flowed through these meetings as the brightest minds of the age sought to further the greatness of their people. The Atlanteans were skilled in many things. They could predict the movement of the stars, communicate with the creatures of the sea, and even manipulate the forces of nature. They had built machines that could harness the power of wind, water, and fire, and their ships sailed the seas faster than any other vessel. The air was filled with the sound of laughter and excitement as new discoveries were made every day. Yet in the corners of the city there were whispers of a change that was coming. A shift in the winds, a disturbance in the sea. The wise elders who had studied the stars and the currents for decades began to sense something ominous approaching. The balance they had worked so hard to maintain seemed fragile, and the light that shone so brightly over Atlantis began to feel just ever so slightly like it was flickering. But for now, the people of Atlantis remained unaware. They reveled in their success, believing their power and knowledge were enough to protect them from anything that might threaten their beloved city. In the warmth of the evening, as the first rays of the moon bathed the island in a gentle glow, life continued as it always had, filled with hope, beauty, and the belief that Atlantis was destined to stand forever. Little did they know the seeds of their downfall had already been planted. If you liked this story about the struggle for the future of our planet, please support us. Share your opinion in the comments. What does the principle of balance mean to you, and how do you think we can use the knowledge of the past to build a better future? Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you don't miss new inspiring stories about how we can change the world. As the days passed in the sun-drenched streets of Atlantis, the air seemed to thicken with an unspoken tension. The wise seers, who had once been regarded as mere mystics, began to speak in cryptic tongues. Their eyes, once serene and calm, now shimmered with a new urgency, as if they had glimpsed something far beyond the veil of time. In the heart of the temple, where the sacred oracles meditated and sought the divine will, the first prophecy was spoken. The high priestess, a woman of advanced age, yet sharp as a blade, stepped forward with trembling hands, holding an ancient scroll that had been passed down for generations. With a voice barely above a whisper, she spoke the words that chilled the hearts of those present. The sun will not rise as it once did, and the sea will swallow the land in its wrath. The gods have spoken, and their fury shall come to pass. The crowd fell silent, their breaths caught in their throats. At first, many dismissed the prophecy as the ramblings of an old woman. After all, how could such a mighty civilization, so rich in knowledge and power, fall to the whims of fate? Atlantis had never known defeat, never known destruction. The seers had spoken of many challenges before, but they had always overcome them. Yet the signs were undeniable. Strange occurrences began to stir across the island. Unseasonal storms whipped up on the horizon, their dark clouds swirling ominously, casting a shadow over the once bright sky. Fish, the lifeblood of Atlantis's food supply, began to vanish from the surrounding waters, and the crops that flourished so abundantly in the fertile soil started to wither. The once steady winds grew erratic, throwing the delicate balance of the city's machinery into disarray. Whispers of fear spread through the streets. The once confident citizens began to question their place in the world, wondering if perhaps their advancements had come at a price they had yet to understand. Could the gods, whose favor they had long enjoyed, now be turning against them? King Atlas, ever the rational leader, summoned the wisest of his council to deliberate on the strange happenings. In the grand council hall, voices rose in disagreement, some calling for action, others urging patience. But despite their differences, all eyes were drawn to the high priestess, who had returned to the temple to mediate in the wake of the unfolding events. Her words were clear when she spoke again. The fate of Atlantis is sealed, not by the gods, but by the hearts of its people. Greed, pride, and desire for control have led them astray. They have forgotten the balance that once held them together. King Atlas, unable to deny the growing unrest, called for a meeting with his closest allies. There, in the dim light of the council chamber, they discussed the path forward. Should they seek to appease the gods with offerings and prayers? Should they attempt to change their course, to humble themselves before the powers they had long served? But it was too late. The course of history had already been set in motion, and the seeds of destruction planted in the hearts of men were beginning to sprout. The gods had warned them, but their pride had led them to ignore the signs. As the first crack of thunder echoed through the sky that evening, the people of Atlantis fell into uneasy sleep, unaware that the very ground beneath them was beginning to tremble. The winds had shifted. The once calm and predictable breezes that swept over the shores of Atlantis were now filled with a restless energy, a deep foreboding that no one could ignore. The people of the island went about their daily lives, but there was an unease in the air, a feeling that something was brewing on the horizon, something far beyond their control. The great temple of Poseidon stood as a beacon in the heart of the city, its towering spires reaching toward the heavens as if pleading for mercy. Inside, the high priests and priestesses gathered in secret, consulting their ancient texts and invoking the power of the sea god. The prophecies that had been spoken by the high priestess had become a dark cloud over the city, and the weight of her words hung heavy in the air. In the council hall, King Atlas, once a figure of absolute certainty, now appeared lost, as though the very foundation of his belief in the island's invincibility was beginning to crumble. He summoned his most trusted advisors to discuss the worsening signs. "The earth trembles beneath our feet and the waters churn with fury," one of the scholars reported, his voice wavering. "We can feel it in the very air. There is a disturbance in the forces that govern this world." Atlas frowned, his brow furrowed in deep thought. "The gods are angry," he murmured, more to himself than anyone else. "But what have we done to provoke them? We have honored them, revered them for centuries. Yet as the days passed, it became impossible to ignore the signs. The seas, once calm and nurturing, grew violent. Fishermen who ventured out into the water returned with stories of strange, monstrous waves that seemed to appear from nowhere, crashing down on their boats with terrifying force. The once azure waters surrounding the island turned dark and murky, as though the ocean itself was preparing to swallow them whole. The once vibrant city of Atlantis, with its shimmering golden towers and crystal-clear streets, began to lose its luster. The fires that powered their machines faltered, the great wheels of their magnificent devices slowed. The winds that once powered their ships were no longer reliable, and the air grew heavy with a dampness that chilled the skin. The earth, too, was no longer as steady as it once had been. Small tremors shook the island regularly, sending cracks through the roads and fissures in the great temple's walls. The people of Atlantis began to gather in the temples, seeking solace in prayer. But even the high priests, who had long been the keepers of the divine will, seemed uneasy. The oracles, who had once read the stars with ease, now stared into the heavens in confusion. The stars, too, were no longer in alignment. "It is as if the gods have abandoned us," said one of the high priests, his voice thick with dread. "Their favor has turned to wrath." Desperation set in as the island's leaders tried to make sense of the unfolding disaster. They sent messengers to distant lands, hoping to find answers. But the response was always the same. No one had seen such a phenomenon before. The gods were silent, and the seas were rising. In the midst of the growing turmoil, a strange figure appeared in the city. Cloaked in tattered robes, with an air of ancient wisdom, the traveler came from the farthest reaches of the world. His face was hidden in shadow, and he spoke in riddles, offering cryptic warnings of what was to come. "The storm you feel is not of nature," he said, his voice low and melodic, but of the heart. The pride of men has made the gods blind to your pleas. Atlantis will fall, but it is not the sea that will destroy it. It is the arrogance of those who ruled it. The city buzzed with rumors of the mysterious traveler. Some dismissed him as a madman, others as a prophet. But as the days wore on and the signs grew ever more undeniable, many began to believe that this stranger might hold the key to the island's survival. Yet it was already too late. The storm was gathering both in the hearts of the Atlanteans and in the skies above. A final reckoning was drawing near, and the once great civilization of Atlantis stood on the edge of oblivion, unaware that their fate was sealed not by the gods, but by their own actions. The sea, once a friend, now whispered of an impending doom that no one could outrun. The storm had come, and with it, the end of Atlantis. The storm that had been whispered about in the darkest corners of Atlantis began to take shape in the sky. Clouds, once white and pure, now churned with a malevolent darkness, stretching as far as the eye could see. The winds howled like wolves on the hunt, and the earth trembled beneath the feet of its inhabitants. The city, once a shining beacon of civilization, seemed to hold its breath as the first drops of rain fell, cold, sharp, and heavy with the sense of foreboding. King Atlas, standing at the pinnacle of his great palace, looked out over his city, his heart heavy with the weight of his people's future. The once vibrant streets now lay under a veil of dust, their gold surfaces dull and tarnished. The sound of the sea, once a peaceful lullaby to the islanders, now rose in volume, its waves crashing against the shore with an unrelenting fury. "It is happening," Atlas murmured, his voice barely a whisper. "The gods have turned their backs on us." In the temple of Poseidon, the high priestess, who had once prophesied the coming of this day, now stood at the altar, her eyes closed in prayer. The sea god's wrath was no longer a distant promise. It was now a tangible force, ready to consume them all. Her hands trembled as she placed a final offering on the altar, but she knew deep within her soul that the time for appeasing the gods had passed. The storm was not a punishment. It was the inevitable consequence of their hubris. As the city prepared for the worst, the once bustling streets emptied. Families huddled together in their homes, seeking shelter from the storm, while the great temples and statues of the gods loomed over them, silent and unmoving. The magnificent machines that powered the city, once symbols of human ingenuity, now stood still, their gears rusted and their energy drained. The sea rose higher with each passing hour, its dark waters creeping ever closer to the city's shores. The wind screamed through the streets, tearing at the fabric of the once proud civilization, pulling down banners, uprooting trees, and crashing the great ships docked in the harbor. The ocean had turned against them, no longer a friend to the Atlanteans, but a fierce and vengeful force determined to reclaim what it had once given. As night fell, the full force of the storm descended upon Atlantis. Lightning split the sky, illuminating the dark waters below. The sea, once calm and beautiful, had turned into a monstrous beast, its waves rising like towering walls, crashing against the walls of the city with terrifying power. At the palace, King Atlas stood firm, his gaze fixed on the chaos unfolding before him. His mind raced, trying to find a solution, a way to save his people, but deep down he knew the truth. The end had come. The city, the people, the land, and the very sea itself were beyond saving. The gods had warned them, and they had ignored the signs. The pride of Atlantis had blinded them to the true balance of the world, and now the consequences were being realized. The storm that raged around them wasn't just the fury of Poseidon. It was the fury of nature, of time, and of the very forces they had sought to control. In the distance, a massive wave rose, taller than any building, a wall of water that seemed to stretch toward the heavens. The people of Atlantis, standing in the streets and watching from their windows, saw it coming, and for the first time in their lives, fear gripped their hearts. The wave crashed down upon the city with unimaginable force, tearing through everything in its path. Atlantis was sinking, and there was no escaping the inevitable. The once great civilization that had ruled the seas, that had stood as a symbol of power and knowledge, was being swallowed whole by the very force it had tried to master. As the waves continued to flood the city, the cries of the people were lost in the roar of the ocean. The grand structures that had once reached for the heavens were now being consumed by the depths. The golden streets were buried under the rising tide, and the once glorious temples to the gods were reduced to rubble. And as the last remnants of Atlantis disappeared beneath the waves, a single, eerie silence settled over the island. The storm, the sea, and the gods had taken their toll. Atlantis had fallen, not because of the wrath of the gods, but because of the arrogance of those who had forgotten the balance of nature. In the stillness, only the ocean remained as it had been before. The island was gone, and with it the memories of a civilization that had once dreamed of eternity. The sea, now calm once more, held the secrets of Atlantis deep within its depths, a forgotten story to be whispered only in the dreams of those who dared to remember. The dawn after the storm broke over Atlantis like the first breath of a new world. The once golden sun barely pierced the grey, overcast sky. The winds, which had roared with fury, were now still, as if the earth itself had exhaled in relief. The city, once vibrant and proud, now lay submerged in an eerie silence. No sounds of the bustling marketplace or the lively streets filled the air. Only the faint lapping of the sea against the broken remnants of the city. Where magnificent temples and towers once reached for the sky, there were only ruins. Some structures had collapsed entirely, while others were half submerged in the rising tide. The once pristine streets were now buried beneath layers of mud and water, a stark contrast to the gleaming metropolis that had stood tall just a day before. The survivors, those few who had escaped the worst of the storm's fury, wandered through the wreckage, shock and disbelief etched on their faces. They couldn't grasp the extent of the destruction. The streets they had once walked with confidence were now unrecognizable, and the grand city that had been the center of the world was reduced to rubble. The proud island that had once stood as a beacon of strength was now nothing but a memory. King Atlas, the leader who had commanded the respect of his people, was gone. His palace, once a symbol of his power, lay in ruins. Those who had sought refuge within its walls had perished, overwhelmed by the fierce tides. King Atlas, who had once believed that no force could threaten his kingdom, had been swallowed by the ocean, just like his city. But amid the destruction, the survivors found hope in the words of the high priestess. Standing in the wreckage of the great temple, she addressed the grieving crowd, her voice carrying the weight of her wisdom. "The gods have not abandoned us," she said, her voice steady but filled with sorrow. "We have brought this upon ourselves. It is not their wrath that destroyed Atlantis, but our own pride." Her words hung heavily in the air. The survivors, though shaken by grief, began to understand. The fall of Atlantis was not an act of divine vengeance, but a consequence of their own arrogance. For too long, the Atlanteans had believed that their mastery over nature would protect them. They had controlled the elements, bent them to their will, and in doing so they had forgotten the balance that once existed between them and the earth. "The gods have not punished us," the high priestess continued, "but they have given us a second chance. The lessons of the past must guide us as we rebuild." The survivors listened in silence, understanding that they had been given an opportunity to start anew. They had lost everything, family, homes, and the city they had loved. But they had been given a chance to rebuild not just the physical city, but their way of life. In the days that followed, the survivors began to rebuild. They worked together, their hearts heavy with sorrow, but filled with resolve. The grand machines that once powered their city were abandoned, replaced by simple structures built from sustainable materials. They no longer sought to control the forces of nature, but to live in harmony with them. The once grandiose temples to the gods were repaired not with offerings of gold and sacrifice, but with humility and respect. The people of Atlantis had been gifted with unimaginable power, but they had abused it. They had tried to harness the forces of the earth and sea without considering the consequences. Now, they understood that true power lay not in domination, but in balance. As the years passed, the memory of Atlantis faded into legend. The once great city with its shining streets and magnificent towers was no more. But the lessons learned from its fall endured. The survivors, scattered across the world, carried with them the wisdom of their ancestors. And in the hearts of those who remembered, the story of Atlantis lived on, not as a tale of glory and invincibility, but as a reminder that no civilization, no matter how powerful, could endure without balance. The sea, once a friend, had become their judge, and in its depths it held the final secret of Atlantis. The story of the great city had ended, but the lessons of its rise and fall would echo for generations to come. Atlantis had fallen, but its spirit endured, not in the ruins of the city, but in the hearts of those who had learned from its destruction. Years passed, and the survivors of Atlantis, scattered across distant lands, rebuilt their lives in the wake of the great destruction. The once great island was no more, its name whispered only in the legends of those who had once called it home. Yet the memory of Atlantis, its rise and fall, lived on in the hearts of its people and in the stories they told. Though the physical ruins of Atlantis were now lost beneath the waves, its lessons remained. The survivors carried with them the wisdom of their ancestors, understanding that true greatness was not found in the accumulation of power or wealth, but in the balance between nature and mankind. They had learned the hard way that unchecked ambition and arrogance could bring even the mightiest civilization to its knees. The descendants of the Atlanteans settled in far-flung regions, finding new lands where they could rebuild their communities, but always with the knowledge that the gods had not abandoned them. They had only given them a chance to learn. In these new lands, they respected the earth, the sea, and the sky, ensuring that their way of life was sustainable and in harmony with the world around them. Over time, the wisdom of the Atlanteans found its way into the hearts of other civilizations. The ancient knowledge of their magical abilities, their technological wonders, and their philosophical teachings spread through the world, influencing those who came after them. The story of Atlantis became a symbol of both the heights of human achievement and the dangers of overreaching. The great libraries of Atlantis, filled with texts on science, philosophy, and magic, were lost when the island sank beneath the waves. But small fragments of these texts were recovered, passed down through the generations. The ideas contained within those ancient books, once the foundation of Atlantean society, became the foundation of many new societies. Some of the greatest minds of the ancient world, inspired by the story of Atlantis, sought to understand the mysteries of the universe and learn from the mistakes of the past. In the far reaches of the world, a new generation of scholars and philosophers studied the ancient writings of the Atlanteans. They marveled at the advanced knowledge and wisdom that had once existed on the island and vowed to ensure that history did not repeat itself. They built their societies on the principles of balance, humility, and respect for the natural world. Principles that had been ingrained in the Atlanteans but had been lost before their fall. As time continued to pass, the memory of Atlantis transformed into myth. The once mighty civilization became a tale told by firesides, a story of a lost world, a place of wonder and magic that had been swallowed by the sea. Yet as the centuries turned, the spirit of Atlantis lived on, passed down through generations like a silent promise. And then, one day, the sea revealed a secret. A team of explorers, guided by ancient maps and the stories of long-forgotten lands, set out on a voyage to uncover the mysteries of the deep. Their journey led them to a part of the ocean where the currents were strange, where the water shimmered with an unnatural light. It was here, beneath the surface, that they discovered the ruins of a city, perfectly preserved in the depths of the sea. The explorers, awestruck by what they had found, marveled at the intricacy of the stonework, the elegant columns, and the grand archways that seemed to stretch endlessly beneath the water. The architecture was unlike anything they had ever seen, and the sheer scale of the city left them speechless. As they carefully explored the underwater ruins, they uncovered inscriptions, ancient writings in a language no one had seen before. But as they studied the symbols, they began to understand. The city beneath the waves was none other than Atlantis, the legendary island that had once been the cradle of civilization. The discovery of the ruins sent shockwaves through the world. Scholars and historians, philosophers and scientists all raced to study the relics of the lost city. The ancient knowledge of the Atlanteans, once thought to be nothing more than myth, had been preserved beneath the ocean for millennia. As the mysteries of Atlantis were slowly uncovered, one thing became clear. The legacy of the great civilization lived on, not just in the physical remnants of their city, but in the ideals they had left behind. The lessons of balance, humility, and respect for nature had endured through the ages, shaping the course of human history. The rediscovery of Atlantis, however, was not just a scientific achievement. It was a reminder that no matter how far we travel, no matter how much we grow, we must never forget the lessons of the past. The story of Atlantis was not just a warning, but a beacon, a symbol of what could be achieved when humanity lived in harmony with the earth, and what could be lost when it strayed too far from the path. And so, as the ruins of Atlantis were uncovered and studied, its legacy continued to inspire new generations. The spirit of Atlantis lived on, not in the ruins that lay beneath the waves, but in the hearts and minds of those who sought to learn from its rise and fall. The story of Atlantis, once lost to the depths of the ocean, had found its way back into the world, reminding all who listened that greatness is not in what we build, but in how we choose to live. Years passed since the discovery of Atlantis. As the ruins of the once great city were slowly uncovered, the world watched in awe as the hidden legacy of the Atlanteans came to light. What had once been considered nothing more than a myth now stood before them, a testament to the power, knowledge, and wisdom that had shaped the lost civilization. But while the world marveled at the great city, something stirred beneath the surface, something that had long been forgotten, an ancient force buried deep within the heart of Atlantis. It had slumbered for centuries, waiting for the right moment to awaken. It began subtly at first, a strange shift in the weather, unusual patterns in the tides, and whispers on the wind that seemed to carry the weight of forgotten knowledge. People began to feel it, a sense that something was stirring beneath the earth, something old and powerful that had been hidden for ages. In the heart of the restored ruins, a group of scholars gathered to study the newly uncovered inscriptions. They had painstakingly translated the ancient texts and pieced together the history of Atlantis, but as they delved deeper into the knowledge of the past, they found something that made them pause, something that had never been noticed before. In the deepest chamber of the temple, beneath a crumbling altar, they uncovered a hidden scroll. Its surface was cracked, the ink faded with age, but the words were still legible. The scroll spoke of a prophecy, one that had been passed down through the generations of Atlanteans. It was a prophecy that spoke of a time when Atlantis would return, not as a physical city, but as an awakening of its spirit, its knowledge, and its wisdom. The prophecy told of a time when the world would be in peril, when mankind's hubris and greed would threaten to destroy the balance of the earth. And when that time came, the spirit of Atlantis would rise again, bringing with it the knowledge to restore balance to the world. For the scholars, the discovery of this prophecy was both thrilling and terrifying. They knew that the ancient power of Atlantis had been hidden for a reason. It was a force unlike any other, capable of changing the course of history. But with such power came great responsibility. As the days went by, strange events began to unfold. The weather grew even more erratic, storms raged, the seas rose higher, and earthquakes shook the land. People across the world felt an unease, as though the very earth was trembling in anticipation of something. The air seemed to hum with energy, and the night sky was filled with strange lights, like stars that had drifted from their places. The world had entered a new era, one that was charged with the awakening of ancient forces. The prophecy of Atlantis had been set into motion. It was during one of these strange nights, when the stars seemed to align in a way that had never been seen before, that the first sign of the return of Atlantis appeared. A young woman named Lyra, a descendant of the survivors of Atlantis, stood on the edge of a cliff overlooking the ocean. She'd always felt a connection to the ancient city, though she had never fully understood why. She had studied the ancient texts, read the legends, and listened to the whispers of her ancestors. But that night, something felt different. She could feel the energy in the air, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. As the moon rose higher in the sky, Lyra closed her eyes and reached out with her mind, focusing on the ancient knowledge that had been passed down through her bloodline. She felt a surge of power, a connection to something far greater than herself. The earth trembled beneath her feet, and the ocean surged as if responding to her call. And then in the distance she saw it, a faint glow on the horizon, as though the very waters themselves were coming alive. The city of Atlantis, or rather its spirit, was returning. It was not the physical city that had once stood on the shores, but the power of the knowledge and wisdom that had been lost when the island sank beneath the waves. The sea had kept it hidden, protected from those who would abuse it. But now, in this moment of crisis, the time had come for Atlantis to rise again. Lyra stood frozen, her heart pounding in her chest. She knew that the world was about to change. The knowledge of Atlantis, the wisdom of the ages, was returning to guide humanity. But it would not be without consequence. The spirit of Atlantis was not a gift to be taken lightly. It was a force of nature, and with it came the responsibility to restore balance to the world. As the light on the horizon grew brighter, Lyra felt the weight of her ancestors' knowledge fill her mind. The prophecy had come true. Atlantis had returned, but it was not the city itself that would change the world. It was the wisdom that it had left behind, the knowledge that had once been lost, now ready to guide humanity into a new era. In that moment, Lyra knew what she had to do. The power of Atlantis was not hers to wield alone. It was a gift, a responsibility, and a challenge that would require the cooperation of all the people of the earth. The spirit of Atlantis had returned, and it was time for humanity to learn from its rise and fall. As the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Lyra turned toward the ruins of Atlantis, the ancient city that had once been lost to the sea. She knew that the journey ahead would be long and difficult, but it was a journey that must be made. The knowledge of Atlantis would guide them, but it was up to the people of the world to embrace the lessons of the past and create a future where balance, humility, and respect for nature would once again reign. The sun rose, casting its golden light over the ruins of Atlantis, And for the first time in centuries, the world felt as though it was beginning anew. The spirit of Atlantis had returned, not to rule but to guide, and in its light, humanity had a chance to reclaim what had been lost and build a future worthy of the lessons learned from the past. The days following the return of Atlantis were filled with uncertainty. The world, now aware that the spirit of the lost city had risen from the depths, stood on the precipice of a new age. The ancient power that had once belonged to Atlantis, the wisdom of the sages and the forgotten technologies were once again accessible. Yet this gift was not without its burden. The rise of Atlantis brought not only the promise of salvation, but also the weight of responsibility. Lyra, still reeling from the incredible events that had unfolded before her eyes, found herself at the center of the world's attention. As a descendant of Atlantis, she was now the key to unlocking the secrets that had been buried for centuries. The ancient knowledge, though powerful, could not be accessed by all. It required someone who understood the balance between the old ways and the new, someone who had the wisdom to guide humanity without repeating the mistakes of the past. In the weeks that followed, Lyra was joined by scholars, philosophers, and leaders from all corners of the world. They came to her seeking answers, hoping that she could unlock the vast stores of knowledge that Atlantis had once held. But Lyra knew that this was not just a matter of recovering ancient scrolls or deciphering old texts. The power of Atlantis was a force far beyond simple knowledge. It was a philosophy, a way of life that required balance, humility, and reverence for the forces of nature. One evening, as Lyra sat at the edge of the ruined city, watching the waves lap against the shore, she felt the presence of the spirits of Atlantis surrounding her. The air was thick with the energy of the sea, and she could hear the faint whispers of ancient voices calling out to her from the depths. She knew that the time had come to understand the true meaning of the prophecy. The spirit of Atlantis was not simply a relic of the past, it was a living, breathing force, one that had been created by the people of the island and was now returning to guide the world. But with this return came a challenge. Would humanity heed the lessons of the past, or would they fall into the same traps of greed and ambition that had led to Atlantis's destruction? The answer, Lyra realized, lay within her. She was not the sole bearer of Atlantis's knowledge, but rather a guide, a bridge between the past and the future. She could share the wisdom of the ancients, but it was up to the people of the world to choose how they would use it. The future of the world rested on their ability to find harmony between the power they had gained and the respect they owed to the earth. As Lyra walked through the ruins, she came across a fragment of a once grand tablet, half buried in the sand. It was inscribed with a message in the ancient language of Atlantis, one that had long been forgotten. As she studied the markings, she felt the power of the message resonate within her. The tablet spoke of the eternal cycle of creation and destruction, of how civilizations rise and fall, but the earth remains. She realized that Atlantis's story was not just a warning. It was a lesson about the fragility of power and the importance of respecting the natural order. The city had fallen not because of a single mistake, but because of generations of hubris, greed, and disregard for the very forces that had made their civilization great. It was a reminder that no matter how powerful a society becomes, it must remain humble, aware of its limitations, and always strive for balance. In that moment, Lyra made a vow. She wouldn't let the mistakes of Atlantis repeat themselves. She would lead the world toward a future where knowledge and power were not used to dominate, but to protect and nurture. She would teach humanity to embrace the spirit of Atlantis, not as a tool of control, but as a source of wisdom and harmony. With the rise of Atlantis, a new era had begun, a time for healing, for learning from the past, and for creating a world that respected the delicate balance between humanity and the earth. Lyra stood at the crossroads of history, knowing that the choices made in the coming years would determine whether humanity would thrive or fall into the same darkness that had consumed Atlantis long ago. And as the sun set over the horizon, casting its warm glow on the ruins of Atlantis, she felt the weight of her ancestors' legacy resting on her shoulders. But she also felt a deep sense of peace, knowing that the spirit of Atlantis had returned not to rule, but to guide. The world had been given a second chance. Now it was time to choose wisely. The world had changed since the return of Atlantis. The ancient knowledge that had once been lost beneath the waves now lay before humanity, its secrets ready to be uncovered. Lyra, standing as both the torchbearer and guide of this knowledge, understood the immense responsibility that had fallen upon her. The whispers of Atlantis had begun to spread across the world, and with them came hope, but also fear. While many saw the return of Atlantis as a miracle, others viewed it with suspicion. The power to restore balance was within reach, but it could easily be misused, just as it had been centuries ago. Atlantis had fallen because of the very power that had once made it great. The arrogance to believe that humanity could control the forces of nature. Lyra could feel the weight of her ancestors' mistakes pressing upon her, knowing that she was the key to preventing history from repeating itself. In the weeks that followed, representatives from all corners of the earth came to the ruins of Atlantis. They brought with them their hopes, their dreams, and their concerns. Scientists and philosophers, leaders of nations and ordinary citizens, all of them gathered to witness the awakening of a forgotten world, each eager to see how the wisdom of Atlantis could transform their own lives. Yet as Lyra stood at the center of this new world, she knew that true transformation wouldn't come from the knowledge alone. It was not the ancient texts or artifacts that held the true power. It was the lessons embedded within them. The knowledge of Atlantis was not simply a gift, but a challenge. It demanded that humanity evolve, that they take responsibility for the world around them, and that they restore balance between progress and nature. Lyra began the arduous task of teaching the world the lessons that Atlantis had learned, but had forgotten in its arrogance. The great knowledge of the past was spread out before the world, and she knew it had to be approached with care. There was power in the ancient machines, the forgotten sciences, and the deep magic that had once flowed through Atlantis. But it was a power that required balance, a power that could either heal the earth or destroy it. The first lesson was simple: humility. The people of Atlantis had been given extraordinary abilities, but they had used them recklessly. They had built machines that harnessed the power of the sea and the wind, but they had not respected the forces that drove them. The gods, in their wisdom, had seen this flaw and taken Atlantis from the world to give it time to reflect. Lyra taught the people that true strength lies not in domination, but in collaboration with the natural world. The second lesson was that knowledge without wisdom could lead to devastation. The ancient city had boasted incredible scientific advancements, machines that could manipulate the weather, heal the sick, and communicate across vast distances. But those same inventions had also brought about the destruction of Atlantis. Lyra's mission was clear. Humanity must learn to use the knowledge of Atlantis, not to conquer, but to protect. This knowledge must be shared, but only in a way that respected the fragile balance of the earth. The third lesson, and perhaps the most difficult, was acceptance. humanity must accept that not everything could be controlled. There were forces in the world far beyond their understanding. Storms, earthquakes, the rise and fall of the tides. Atlantis had tried to control these forces, to bend them to its will, and in doing so, it had brought about its own downfall. Lyra urged the world to learn that sometimes the greatest strength lay in knowing when to step back and allow the natural world to flow as it would. The world began to listen. Slowly, the wisdom of Atlantis took root in the hearts and minds of those who had once sought only power. Cities across the globe began to rebuild with respect for the land, drawing on the lessons Lyra had taught them. The technology of Atlantis, once considered a tool for domination, was now used to heal the earth, restoring forests, purifying the seas, and repairing the damage done by centuries of neglect. Yet, despite the progress, there was still resistance. Some clung to the old ways, fearing that embracing the lessons of Atlantis would strip them of their power. Others saw the return of Atlantis as a chance to seize control and use its knowledge for their own gain. The balance was fragile, and Lyra knew that the world was not yet ready to fully embrace the responsibility that came with this ancient wisdom. In the midst of this, Lyra continued to stand at the ruins of Atlantis, feeling the weight of the city's history in the air. She had come to realize that while Atlantis could offer guidance, the true power to change the world lay not in the wisdom of the past, but in the hearts of the people. The path forward would not be easy. It would require courage, patience, and a deep understanding of the mistakes made by those who had come before. As the sun set over the ocean, casting its golden light over the ruins, Lyra knew that the world had been given a second chance. The spirit of Atlantis had returned, not as a conqueror, but as a teacher. The world had been awakened, and it was up to humanity to decide whether they would rise with it or let the lessons of the past slip away, forgotten once more. The journey had only just begun. Years after the return of Atlantis, the world had begun to change. The seeds of the ancient civilization's wisdom had taken root in many places, and slowly a new world order began to emerge. The technology of Atlantis, once seen as a dangerous tool for domination, was now being used to restore the Earth's natural balance. Cities were rebuilt with respect for the environment, and new ways of living emerged that honored both progress and nature. Yet with every advancement came resistance. While many embraced the teachings of Atlantis, others saw it as a threat to their power. Nations that had once relied on unchecked industry began to fear the changes brought by the New World Order. They resisted the ancient wisdom, seeing it as a way to diminish their influence. Political leaders, driven by the same greed that had led to Atlantis' downfall, sought to bend the knowledge of the past to their own ends. Lyra, standing at the center of the world's awakening, watched as these tensions began to grow. The path forward had never been easy, but now, with the ancient wisdom being applied in real-world circumstances, the fractures in society began to show. There was disagreement not just over the knowledge of Atlantis, but over how it should be used. The balance that had once been so central to the Atlantean philosophy seemed elusive, as those with power continued to vie for control. It was during one of these moments of uncertainty that Lyra was called upon to mediate a summit. World leaders, scientists, and philosophers from all corners of the globe gathered to discuss how the knowledge of Atlantis would be integrated into the fabric of human civilization. The world, in many ways, stood at a crossroads, and the decisions made at this summit would determine the course of the future. The meeting took place in a restored amphitheater that had once been used for the most important debates of Atlantis. As Lyra entered the grand hall, she was struck by the sight of the gathering. It was a symbol of hope, a reminder that humanity, despite its flaws, was still capable of working together for a better future. But as the leaders took their seats, Lyra sensed a growing unease in the air. The knowledge of Atlantis, once a gift, had become a weapon, and some were prepared to wield it for their own gain. The summit began with speeches of unity. Leaders from every nation spoke of the great potential for collaboration, of the need to embrace the wisdom of the past to build a sustainable future. But as the hours wore on, the tone began to shift. Some argued that the ancient technologies should be used to accelerate industrial progress, while others advocated for a more cautious approach, focusing on healing and restoration. In the midst of the debate, a powerful voice rose. A representative from one of the largest industrial nations, a man whose influence had grown as the world adapted to Atlantis' knowledge, spoke of a future built on technological advancement. "We must harness this knowledge fully," he said, his voice echoing through the hall. "Atlantis rose to power through innovation. To ensure our place in the world, we must do the same." His words were met with applause, but Lyra felt a chill in her bones. She had heard this argument before, this desire to control and dominate. She knew that this path led to the same dangers that had once doomed Atlantis. Lyra stood and walked to the center of the hall, her presence commanding attention. The room fell silent as she began to speak. "The power of Atlantis was not in its ability to control nature," she said, her voice calm but resolute. "The power of Atlantis lay in its understanding of balance. It was a civilization that learned to work with the world, not against it. And yet we have seen what happens when that wisdom is ignored. We are at a crossroads, and the choices we make today will determine whether we will live in harmony with nature or whether we will once again become slaves to our own ambition." The room remained quiet, and for a moment Lyra felt as though her words had fallen on deaf ears. But as she spoke, the faces in the crowd began to shift. Some nodded in agreement, while others looked down, deep in thought. She knew that the path forward would not be easy, but it was the only path that could ensure the survival of both humanity and the planet. In the days following the summit, the world seemed to pause. Leaders returned to their countries weighed down by the knowledge that they had been given a second chance, and that the path they chose would shape the future of the earth. Lyra, too, returned to the ruins of Atlantis, where she sat alone by the sea. She could feel the presence of the ancient city surrounding her, the wisdom of her ancestors filling her mind. But she also knew that the battle was far from over. The world was fractured, its people divided by their visions of the future. Some would embrace the lessons of Atlantis, while others would try to use its knowledge for power. Lyra knew that the task ahead was greater than one person, greater than one civilization. It would take a collective effort to restore balance, to build a future that honored the past without repeating its mistakes. The spirit of Atlantis had returned, but now its true test had begun. The wisdom it offered would not be handed down easily. It would require sacrifice, understanding, and a deep respect for the world they all shared. As the waves crashed against the shore, Lyra made a vow to herself. She would continue to guide the world, to share the lessons of Atlantis. And though the path forward was uncertain, she knew one thing for sure. The story of Atlantis was not over. It had only just begun. The months that followed the summit were filled with tension, as the world continued to grapple with the legacy of Atlantis. The delicate balance Lyra had spoken of was still elusive. As nations debated how to integrate the ancient knowledge into their societies, the forces of greed, ambition, and fear struggled against the more noble aspirations of unity and harmony. In the wake of the summit, there was a marked division in the world. On one side, those who sought to exploit the technologies of Atlantis for rapid advancement, pushing toward an era of even greater industrialization and dominance. On the other, a growing movement of thinkers, leaders and citizens who sought to embrace the wisdom of Atlantis in a more measured way, focusing on healing the earth and restoring balance rather than exploiting it for progress alone. Lyra, who had hoped that the world would unite behind the wisdom of Atlantis, found herself at the center of an ever-deepening divide. Despite her efforts to act as a mediator, her words were often twisted by those with their own agendas. The growing tensions fueled by old rivalries and new desires for control were slowly pushing humanity toward a precipice. The technological advances brought by Atlantis had been extraordinary. Energy that once would have been considered magic, healing techniques that could cure diseases that had once ravaged entire populations, and methods for harnessing nature's power in ways previously unimaginable. But there was one thing that Atlantis had understood that the modern world was still struggling to grasp. Power without balance was destruction. The cities that had begun to embrace these technologies too quickly saw the consequences. They overextended, draining resources and disrupting ecosystems. Some began to see the cracks in the facade of their so-called progress. The leaders who had once championed these new technologies now faced growing unrest. The Earth, while it had been restored in some places, was still reeling from centuries of exploitation. The climate was erratic, the oceans still polluted with remnants of the past, and species were being lost at a rate faster than anyone had anticipated. People began to question if they had made the right choice by embracing Atlantis' wisdom too hastily, pushing forward without the long-term consideration that Atlantis itself had once honored. At the heart of this growing unease stood Lyra. She had seen the potential for change, had felt the collective hope of a world united by the shared lessons of Atlantis. But now, as the winds of change blew stronger, she felt more isolated than ever. Her calls for caution, for balance, fell on deaf ears, or were drowned out by the louder voices of those who wanted to push forward at any cost. One evening, Lyra stood atop the hill that overlooked the ruins of Atlantis, the place where the city had once risen in all its glory. The sun had dipped below the horizon and the sky was ablaze with vibrant colors. The sea, which had once swallowed the city, now lapped gently at the shore. In the stillness, she could feel the spirit of Atlantis all around her, as if the city itself was watching, waiting for humanity to make its choice. As the wind whispered through the ruins, Lyra closed her eyes, and the ancient words of the prophets of Atlantis returned to her mind. The words spoke of cycles, of civilizations that rise and fall, of lessons learned and forgotten. Atlantis had fallen once, and it seemed that history, no matter how many times it was taught, was repeating itself. Humanity, like the Atlanteans before them, was being tested. Could they learn from their past mistakes, or would they too fall into the same traps of ambition and pride? She sighed, a deep and heavy sound. She had always believed in the potential for change, in the ability of humanity to learn from its errors. But now, standing alone in the midst of the ruins, she wondered if they were ready. The knowledge of Atlantis had returned, and with it, the promise of a better future. But it was up to humanity to decide whether they would rise to the challenge or fall once again into chaos. In that moment, Lyra made a decision. She would not stand idly by while the world faced its reckoning. The legacy of Atlantis was not one of despair, but of hope. She would continue to fight for the balance that had once sustained her ancestors and guide humanity back toward the path of wisdom. It would not be easy. There would be resistance, division, and the temptation to exploit the ancient power that lay before them. But Lyra believed in one thing. The spirit of Atlantis had returned not to dominate, but to teach. The road ahead was uncertain, filled with obstacles and challenges. But Lyra was resolved to see it through. She would work tirelessly to ensure that Atlantis' teachings would not be twisted for greed or power, but embraced for the future of all. She would remind the world that knowledge was not a weapon to be wielded, but a tool to be respected. With a final glance at the setting sun, Lyra turned away from the ruins of Atlantis, her heart filled with both resolve and uncertainty. The winds of change had arrived, and with them came the opportunity to rebuild, not just the earth, but the hearts and minds of all those who called it home. The path ahead was unknown, but the lessons of Atlantis had already been written. It was up to humanity to decide whether to follow them. The days following Lyra's decision to fight for the wisdom of Atlantis were filled with uncertainty. The world, still divided, stood at the edge of transformation. Leaders and thinkers continued to struggle with how to best use the knowledge of the past, and the battle for control over its potential raged on. Yet in this moment of tension, something changed, something small but significant. It began with the people. Across the globe, in cities built with both the wisdom of Atlantis and the modern challenges of the world, a shift was happening. Ordinary citizens, farmers, engineers, teachers, and artists had begun to take action, using the ancient knowledge not as a tool for domination, but as a tool for restoration. They focused on healing the planet, on preserving the balance, rather than exploiting it for wealth or power. In the streets of major cities, small groups gathered, talking about the lessons of Atlantis, sharing their hope for a future built not on the greed of the past, but on mutual respect and understanding. The spirit of Atlantis, which had once been lost, was being embraced by those who understood the responsibility that came with its power. One evening, Lyra received an invitation, a call to join a meeting of this grassroots movement, which had grown beyond her expectations. She hesitated for a moment, unsure if it was truly time for such a step. But the winds had shifted, and she felt the need to be part of something that was taking form, not in the halls of power, but in the hearts of the people. The meeting took place in a small, reclaimed building at the edge of a bustling city, surrounded by those who had long been dismissed by the establishment. Environmentalists, spiritual leaders, and community organizers. They had been quietly working for years, pushing for a world where the ancient wisdom of Atlantis could guide humanity's next steps. Lyra stepped into the room, feeling the weight of the journey ahead. But as she looked around at the faces that greeted her, she saw something she hadn't seen in a long time. Hope. Hope in the hearts of those who believed in a future built on unity, sustainability, and balance. A woman named Maeve, one of the leaders of the movement, welcomed her with a soft smile. "We've been waiting for you," Maeve said, her eyes full of resolve. "It's not about the power we can gain, but the life we can nurture. Atlantis has shown us the way." Lyra sat down with the group, listening as they discussed their plans. They were focused on creating decentralized, sustainable communities, places where knowledge, resources, and technology could be shared in ways that benefited everyone. Their goal wasn't to build the same kind of empire that Atlantis had once been, but to create a world where the power of knowledge was used to heal and not to harm. As the discussion continued, Lyra realized that this was the path forward. This wasn't just about preserving the wisdom of Atlantis. It was about transforming it into a force for global healing. It was a path not of domination, but of cooperation. A vision where the lessons of the past could lead to a future where humanity lived in harmony with the earth, not as its masters, but as its stewards. But the road was still long, and the obstacles ahead were formidable. There were powerful forces still at play. Those who sought to control the knowledge of Atlantis for their own gain, those who believed that unchecked progress was the only way forward. Lyra knew that the struggle was far from over, but as she looked around at the people in the room, she felt something she hadn't felt in a long time. A quiet confidence. This was not the work of governments or corporations. This was the work of individuals, of communities, of people who believed that the future could be different. that humanity could rise above its past mistakes. The movement was small, but it was growing. It was a quiet rebellion against the forces that sought to return the world to its old ways. And it was rooted not in opposition, but in a vision of what could be. A world where the wisdom of Atlantis could guide not just a civilization, but a global community. Lyra knew that the real work was just beginning. The road to change would not be easy, and the forces against them were strong. But as she looked into the eyes of those around her, she saw the spark of a new world beginning to take shape. A world where balance was possible, where humanity could learn from its mistakes and move forward with a sense of responsibility, humility, and respect for the earth. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt that perhaps, just perhaps, the world was ready for the wisdom of Atlantis. It wouldn't happen overnight, but the seeds had been planted. It was up to the people now to water them, to nurture them, and to allow them to grow into something that could truly change the world. The sun set that evening, casting a warm, golden light through the windows, and Lyra felt a sense of peace. The path ahead was still uncertain, but the journey toward the future had begun, and with it, a new hope had awakened. The weeks that followed the meeting with the grassroots movement were both exhausting and invigorating for Lyra. The world was starting to stir. People who had once felt powerless in the face of global challenges were now embracing the power of collective action. From small villages to sprawling cities, the seeds of change were taking root. Yet, despite the growing momentum, Lyra couldn't ignore the tension that still lingered in the air. The forces resisting the return of Atlantis' wisdom were not easily swayed. The industrial giants, the political elites, and the military powers, those who had built their wealth on the exploitation of resources, were watching these movements closely, waiting for a misstep, ready to discredit or sabotage anything that threatened their dominance. But the grassroots movements were persistent. They had the will of the people, and they had something more, the lessons of Atlantis, not as a forgotten dream, but as a living philosophy that could be applied to everyday life. Lyra felt it was time for a bold move. It was one thing to educate small groups about the teachings of Atlantis, but it was another to push those ideas into the wider world, to show the power of this wisdom in action. The first step was to launch a series of pilot projects, small communities designed to put the principles of Atlantis into practice. These communities would focus on sustainability, renewable energy, cooperative economics, and ecological restoration, combining the best of ancient knowledge and modern innovation. She called these initiatives the Atlantean Way, a living experiment in using Atlantis' wisdom to heal the planet. It was risky, Lyra knew. Many would see it as idealistic or impractical, but it was the only way to prove that these ideas weren't just abstract concepts, but could be lived day by day. As the first project came together in a coastal town that had suffered from overfishing and pollution, Lyra felt the weight of the task ahead. The community, though small, was made up of people who believed that Atlantis' knowledge could transform their world. They worked together to restore the coastline, planting seagrasses and cleaning the waters, while solar and wind-powered technologies began to power their homes and businesses. The lessons of sustainability that had once been core to the Atlantean philosophy were now being put into practice, showing that there was another way to live, one that didn't exploit the planet but worked in harmony with it. Yet even as these communities began to show promise, there were signs of pushback. News outlets controlled by industrial magnates began to spread misinformation, claiming that the Atlantean Way was a pipe dream, that such ideals could never be applied on a global scale. There were whispers of sabotage, of efforts to undermine the movement before it could grow. The forces resisting change, though hidden in the shadows, were powerful. Lyra spent many sleepless nights, balancing the weight of hope and doubt. But one morning, as she stood by the sea overlooking the thriving community, something shifted. The fishermen who had once resisted the idea of changing their practices came to her. They spoke of how they had seen the fish return to the waters, how the coastline was coming back to life, and how, for the first time in years, they were seeing the abundance that had once existed. The healing was slow, but it was happening. In the next few months, similar projects began to spring up across the globe, and they began to attract attention, both positive and negative. The true test of the Atlantean way was whether these projects could sustain themselves, whether they could grow and influence the broader world. Could humanity truly learn from the past and apply the ancient wisdom of Atlantis to reshape the future? The challenges were immense. There were still nations more focused on rapid expansion and growth, pushing toward profit at any cost. Yet something was shifting in the collective consciousness. The people who lived in these pilot communities were not just living out a dream. They were showing the world that another way was possible. The media was beginning to take notice. Reports from independent journalists who visited the projects spoke of thriving ecosystems, of human ingenuity working in harmony with nature, of a new economy where people's well-being came before profit. But there was no denying that the resistance to change was still formidable. Lyra knew that the road ahead would be long, that the vision of Atlantis's wisdom wouldn't be realized overnight, but she also knew that the spark had been lit. The vision for a more balanced, harmonious world was no longer a distant hope. It was becoming a reality, one small step at a time. One evening, as Lyra sat with Maeve by a newly constructed solar-powered community center, Maeve spoke of the journey ahead. "We have the wisdom of the ancients, Lyra," Maeve said quietly, "but it's up to us to make sure it's not lost again. We can't let fear or greed dictate our future. The people will decide how this story ends." Lyra nodded. "Yes, but we must keep pushing. The world is watching. If we falter, it will give the old powers the excuse they need to crush us." Maeve smiled, the light from the setting sun catching her eyes. "Then let's show them that we won't falter. Let's show them the true power of the Atlantean way." Lyra felt the strength in Maeve's words, and for the first time in weeks, she allowed herself to feel hope again. The path was unclear, but the people who'd embraced the vision of Atlantis were showing the world that it was possible to create a future where wisdom, balance, and nature stood at the forefront. The winds of change were beginning to blow stronger, and though the road was still fraught with challenges, Lyra knew that together they could chart a course toward a future where Atlantis's spirit was truly alive. Months after the first successful communities built on the principles of Atlantis, the movement was spreading, but resistance was growing stronger. The ideals of Atlantis, sustainability, balance, and harmony with nature, were beginning to clash with the old world systems of unchecked exploitation and rapid growth. The success of the pilot projects, where communities had restored ecosystems, embraced renewable energy, and fostered cooperative economies, had proven that it was possible to live differently. But those in power whose wealth and influence depended on the exploitation of resources were fighting back. Media campaigns were launched to discredit the movement, calling it utopian and impractical. In a major city, Lyra was invited to speak about the success of the Atlantean-inspired communities. The crowd was large, but as she stood before them, she knew that the true work had only just begun. After her speech, the applause felt distant. She knew that the forces against change were deeply entrenched. Her words resonated with many in the crowd, but Lyra realized that speeches alone wouldn't bring lasting change. She needed to unite people, not just through ideals, but through practical, collective action. The old world's resistance to the Atlantean way was still strong. Corporations, political leaders, and industries invested in maintaining the status quo were working tirelessly to prevent any major shifts. Lyra and the movement's leaders began focusing on legislation to prioritize sustainability, clean energy, and ecological restoration. But despite the growing support from the people, powerful industries continued to spread fear, warning that such changes would lead to economic collapse. The struggle for balance was more urgent than ever. Lyra understood that the movement had to evolve beyond small successes. It needed to show that the principles of Atlantis could scale globally. The challenge was proving that sustainable progress was possible without falling into exploitation. Lyra remained resolute. The fight for balance was difficult, but the foundation had been laid. She knew the road ahead was long, but she was not alone. The winds of change were blowing, and with patience and persistence, the lessons of Atlantis would find their place in the world once more. The tension between progress and preservation had never been so evident. Despite the success of the grassroots movement inspired by the wisdom of Atlantis, Lyra knew the battle for the future was far from over. While communities flourished under the Atlantean way, the global forces of industry and politics continued to fight against the very principles of balance and sustainability that had once defined Atlantis. The rise of small, sustainable cities was being overshadowed by the relentless push for unchecked growth from the old power structures. In the face of mounting opposition, Lyra had a realization: they needed to shift tactics. The movement had grown too large to ignore, but to truly influence global change, they would have to engage the powers that be directly. The lesson of Atlantis had always been that knowledge and power were most effective when wielded with caution and responsibility, but now those very forces of caution needed to find a way to show the world that embracing the knowledge of Atlantis was the only sustainable path forward. Lyra had spent the last several weeks meeting with leaders who shared her vision but lacked the resources or platforms to amplify it. She was working tirelessly behind the scenes, building alliances with key global figures, from influential scientists to forward-thinking politicians, each of whom understood the need for a new way forward. But the struggle was exhausting. Every step forward felt met with two steps back. And it wasn't just the powerful few who resisted. Skepticism was widespread among those who were still uncertain about the true potential of the Atlantean way. The pivotal moment came when Lyra was invited to an international summit, convened by a coalition of nations that had expressed growing concern about the environmental and economic crises facing the planet. The summit was set to take place in a city at the heart of a rapidly industrializing country, one of the very places where the old systems of power had held the tightest grip. As the summit approached, Lyra's heart weighed heavy with the stakes. She knew that this summit would be the turning point, the moment when the wisdom of Atlantis either took root in global policy or was relegated to the fringe of history once again. The pressure was immense, but Lyra also saw this as the opportunity to solidify Atlantis's principles as not just a set of ideals, but as a practical guide to saving the planet. When the summit finally began, world leaders gathered in a grand hall filled with the promise of a new direction. Lyra took the stage, feeling the weight of history on her shoulders. She spoke not just as a representative of Atlantis's wisdom, but as a woman who had seen firsthand how this knowledge could heal the earth and change the lives of people. "The time has come," she began, her voice steady, "to move beyond fear, beyond old ways of thinking, and to create a world where humanity lives not in opposition to the earth, but in harmony with it. We have the knowledge of Atlantis at our fingertips, not to dominate, but to restore and renew. If we do not act now, the world we leave behind will be a fractured, desolate one. Atlantis fell because of its hubris. Let us not repeat its mistakes." Her words were met with silence, a heavy, expectant silence. It was clear that some were still skeptical, but Lyra could feel the shift. The urgency was no longer just about idealism, it was about survival. She continued, calling for a global commitment to sustainable practices, the implementation of renewable energy systems, and a reimagining of economic systems that valued the well-being of the planet over profit. The summit was not an instant victory, but it marked the beginning of a shift. Several nations committed to creating a new global framework for sustainability, one that would incorporate the lessons of Atlantis into global policies. Though there was still resistance from certain sectors, a new dialogue had been started, a conversation where the wisdom of the past met the necessity of the future. Lyra left the summit feeling both exhausted and hopeful. The movement had made an impact, but the real work was just beginning. The world was changing, but the forces of greed and control were not going to disappear overnight. It would take continued dedication, collaboration, and patience, yet for the first time, she felt that humanity was ready to embrace the lessons of Atlantis. Not just as a historical curiosity, but as a living philosophy capable of shaping a new era. As Lyra returned to her community, standing again on the shores of the restored coastline, she felt a deep sense of peace. The winds of change were picking up speed, and with every challenge faced, the world was moving closer to the balance that had once defined Atlantis. The months following the summit were filled with a mixture of optimism and caution. Lyra had watched with a sense of guarded hope as the world slowly began to respond to the growing movement for sustainable living. Inspired by Atlantis's wisdom, new policies were being drafted, cities were beginning to incorporate the principles of balance, and communities were becoming more self-sustaining. Yet beneath this progress, Lyra sensed a growing unease, a subtle undercurrent of resistance that could not be ignored. While many governments had pledged to create a more sustainable future, there were still those whose power and wealth depended on the old ways, on the extraction of resources, the dominance of industries that poisoned the earth. These forces, though not as vocal as they had been, were quietly working behind the scenes to slow the progress being made. Lyra began to realize that even the slow but steady rise of the Atlantean way was vulnerable to those with the means to manipulate the system. One evening, after a long day spent meeting with activists and leaders who were working tirelessly to implement the new policies, Lyra sat by the sea. The waves lapped gently at the shore as if the earth itself was trying to soothe her mind. But the calm was fleeting. The doubts in her heart returned, and she couldn't shake the feeling that something was lurking just beyond the horizon, something that could derail everything they had worked for. It was then that Maeve, the leader of the grassroots movement, approached her. "We need to talk," Maeve said, her tone serious though calm. She handed Lyra a small tablet with a list of encrypted reports. "These are from our networks in several cities. There's been an alarming uptick in corporate lobbying, coordinated misinformation campaigns, and covert resistance in some of the very regions that promised to change." Lyra took the tablet, her heart sinking as she scanned through the reports. She had known there would be resistance, but the scope of the effort to sabotage the movement was far greater than she had anticipated. Powerful corporations, quietly funding political candidates, and media outlets that spread fear about the Atlantean way were working to create divisions. They were framing the push for sustainability as an attack on jobs, on freedom, on economic growth. Their influence was subtle but effective. "This isn't just about politics," Maeve continued, her voice low. "It's about controlling the narrative. And right now they're winning." Lyra felt the weight of the situation settle in. They had built a movement rooted in the wisdom of the past, one that could heal the earth and its people. Yet the same forces that had driven Atlantis to ruin, greed, pride, and an insatiable hunger for control, were still present, lurking in the shadows. For the first time, Lyra realized that they were not just fighting for change. They were fighting against a system that had learned to adapt, to fight back even in the face of progress. The forces of the old world were not just going to fade away because people wanted a better future. They would fight tooth and nail to preserve their power. "We need to act fast," Lyra said, her voice resolute. "If we don't show the world how the Atlantean way can work on a larger scale, if we don't prove that the Earth can heal, the opposition will succeed. We need to find a way to make this irreversible." Maeve nodded. "The people are with us, Lyra. The only thing we need now is to prove that the Atlantean way works, not just in small communities, but in the heart of the cities, in the corridors of power." Lyra knew what had to be done. They needed a demonstration, a large-scale project that could show the world that their vision of sustainability, of balance, could work on a global scale. The project would need to be bold, visible, and successful. It had to prove that humanity could change course, and that the wisdom of Atlantis wasn't just a dream. The plan was simple, but the execution would require immense resources and coordination. Lyra reached out to her allies, scientists, environmentalists, and innovators who had long supported the vision of Atlantis. Together, they would initiate a massive, high-profile project, an international effort to restore the Great Barrier Reef, the lungs of the planet's oceans, using the principles of Atlantis's knowledge of ecological balance. The goal was not just to restore the reef, but to demonstrate how humanity could use technology in harmony with nature to heal the planet. The project, dubbed the Atlantean Restoration Initiative, would be the largest of its kind. It would combine cutting-edge science, renewable energy, and eco-restoration techniques, all while fostering global collaboration. But as Lyra prepared for the announcement, she knew that the true challenge lay not in the technology or the science. It was in convincing the world that it was not just possible but essential. The unseen hand of resistance was still working, and Lyra understood that this would be the ultimate test. If the project succeeded, it would prove that the Atlantean way could reshape the world. But failure would only reinforce the doubts and fears of the opposition, giving them the ammunition they needed to destroy the movement. Lyra stood at the edge of the sea once more, watching the waves crash against the shore. The task ahead was daunting, but she could feel the spirit of Atlantis within her, urging her forward. This was the moment to show the world that it was possible to learn from the past, to live in harmony with the earth, and to build a future that was not built on exploitation but on balance and respect. The winds of change were picking up, and this time Lyra would not let them blow in the wrong direction. The announcement of the Atlantean Restoration Initiative sent ripples of excitement and skepticism across the globe. Lyra had gathered an impressive coalition of scientists, activists, and leaders from around the world, all of whom believed in the transformative potential of the project. The goal was simple but monumental: restore the Great Barrier Reef using sustainable technologies and the ecological principles derived from Atlantis's wisdom. It was a bold statement to the world that humanity could heal the Earth without exploiting it. As the first phase of the initiative began, the scale of the project became apparent. Hundreds of experts descended upon the coral reefs of Australia. Teams were assembled to deploy renewable energy systems, install artificial reefs, and employ marine biology techniques designed to revive the once thriving ecosystem. Solar-powered desalination plants would provide fresh water to the affected areas, while innovative techniques of coral farming and regeneration would restore the biodiversity that had been lost. But despite the growing enthusiasm within the scientific community, not everyone was convinced that this Atlantean approach was the right solution. The corporate-backed media quickly shifted their attention to the project, launching a smear campaign questioning its practicality. Is this the new utopia, they asked, or just another failed attempt to turn back time? Lyra knew that the skepticism was inevitable, but she remained focused. This project wasn't just about restoring a reef. It was about showing the world that a new way of living was possible. The success of the Great Barrier Reef project could prove that the principles of balance, sustainability, and cooperation were not just theoretical. They could work. Months passed, and the project began to take shape. Early results showed that some areas of the reef previously devastated by climate change and human activity began to show signs of life. Marine species that had once been absent from the area slowly started to return. Coral was growing in patches where none had existed for decades. The renewable energy systems, though small in scale compared to the global needs, were providing power to research stations and local communities without damaging the environment. But with success came resistance. In boardrooms and government offices, powerful industries were starting to see their grip on the planet's resources slipping. They could not afford for the Atlantean Restoration Initiative to succeed. A world where resources were shared, where nature was valued as much as profit, threatened everything they had worked for. One day, while Lyra was meeting with her team of scientists, a series of reports began to come in. There had been disturbances in the region, deliberate sabotage. Solar panels were found damaged, research stations had been broken into, and vital equipment was mysteriously destroyed. The corporate-backed resistance had begun to use more direct methods to undermine the project. They wanted to silence the movement, to show the world that this vision of sustainability was not only impractical, it was dangerous. Lyra's heart sank, but she refused to let the setbacks derail their progress. They had anticipated resistance, but this was more than she had imagined. The sabotage was coordinated, aimed at weakening the faith of the public and the scientists involved in the restoration effort. The news of the disruptions quickly reached the media, adding fuel to the fire. "The Atlantean Initiative is doomed to fail," one headline read. "Sabotage in the heart of the reef," another screamed. But in the face of this, Lyra found herself rallying the team, reminding them that their mission was far bigger than any corporate interest or media narrative. The world needed to see that the principles of Atlantis weren't just about protecting nature. They were about protecting humanity from the disastrous path it had been on. Lyra held a press conference, standing in front of a crowd of reporters who were hungry for any signs of failure. She addressed the damage done to the project, the sabotage, and the obstacles they were facing. "These attacks are not just on the reef," she said, her voice calm but unwavering. "They are an attack on the future of our planet. The world needs this project to succeed. We cannot let fear and greed dictate the future." The crowd was silent, but her words struck a chord. The media could no longer ignore the reality that the world was divided on this issue. There were powerful forces at play, yes, but the people were beginning to rise, to demand something different, to call for a world that valued sustainability and balance. In the following weeks, the damage from the sabotage was repaired. The media, though still divided, began to shift in tone. People were rallying behind the project, demanding that the government and industries invest in supporting it, not undermining it. The pressure was mounting on the corporate powers trying to hold back the change, and the efforts to stop the initiative only fueled the resolve of the global community. Lyra continued to lead the charge, knowing that this wasn't just about saving a reef, it was about proving that humanity could chart a new course. She knew that the challenges would only grow more difficult, that there would be more setbacks and more resistance, but she also knew that they were not alone. As the project progressed, the early successes of the Atlantean Restoration Initiative began to inspire new projects across the world. What started as a single reef restoration effort was quickly becoming a movement, a living testament to the power of cooperation, balance, and the lessons of the past. And while the struggle was far from over, Lyra could feel a quiet certainty growing within her. The world was beginning to see the truth. The wisdom of Atlantis had not been lost. It had been waiting for this moment, ready to guide humanity toward a sustainable, harmonious future. The battle was still raging, but the tide had begun to turn. The months following the launch of the Atlantean Restoration Initiative saw a significant shift in the global atmosphere. Despite the resistance from powerful industries, the growing movement in support of sustainability began to gain undeniable momentum. The project, which had initially faced doubt and sabotage, was now proving to the world that change was not only possible but essential. Lyra watched with a quiet sense of resolve as the initial setbacks from the sabotage were overcome. The reef restoration continued to show signs of progress. Marine life was flourishing, and the waters around the area were clearer than they had been in years. What had once seemed like an impossible dream was becoming a reality, slowly but surely. And as the news of the success spread, more cities and nations began to take notice. But with success came greater scrutiny. Those who had fought to discredit the initiative were now desperate to find new ways to undermine it. Misinformation campaigns intensified, spreading false claims that the restoration efforts were insufficient or dangerous. The voices of the corporate-backed resistance grew louder, but now the public was less willing to listen. People had seen the positive impact of the project firsthand, and they were starting to demand more projects, more action, and more transparency from their governments. Despite the challenges, Lyra felt the tide shifting in their favor. The world was awakening to the reality that sustainable progress was not a threat, it was a lifeline. The old ways of exploiting the earth were no longer viable, and the lessons of Atlantis were resonating more deeply with every passing day. One evening, as Lyra sat with her team in a makeshift command center set up near the reef, they received a report that would change everything. The local government, pressured by the overwhelming public support and global attention, had decided to step in. They were committing to fund the expansion of the restoration project, providing the necessary resources to scale it up across other critical ecosystems worldwide. It was a moment of triumph. But Lyra knew this victory was not just hers, it was the world's. The people had spoken, and they had made it clear that they would not stand idly by while their planet continued to suffer. The announcement from the government was met with jubilation, but Lyra also knew the next phase of the initiative would be even more demanding. The scale of the restoration effort would require not only more resources, but also a deeper collaboration between nations, industries, and communities. She could feel the weight of what was coming, but for the first time, the weight didn't feel as heavy as before. It was a turning tide. The forces of greed and exploitation had not disappeared, but they were no longer as dominant as they had been. The people were awakening to the fact that the future they had been promised, one of endless growth and consumption, was a lie. Now, more than ever, they understood that true progress lay in balance. As the weeks went by, more projects were announced. The restoration of rainforests, the rehabilitation of polluted rivers, and the creation of sustainable urban spaces. Each project brought the world one step closer to the vision of balance that Atlantis had once represented. Lyra watched as communities rallied around these projects, uniting across borders and cultures, driven by a common purpose. It wasn't perfect, and there were still obstacles, but the shift was undeniable. Humanity was no longer on a path toward destruction. It was on a path toward healing, not just the planet, but itself. In the quiet moments when Lyra stood alone near the reef, watching the vibrant coral regrow beneath the waves, she allowed herself a fleeting sense of peace. The battle was far from over, but they had made it past the hardest part. The knowledge of Atlantis, once lost to time, was now guiding the world once again, and Lyra had become its beacon. The world was changing, the tide had turned, and the future no longer seemed like a distant dream. It was now within reach. As the sun rose over the revitalized reef, Lyra stood on the shore, watching the waves gently lap against the coastline. The early morning light cast a golden hue over the waters, illuminating the thriving marine life below the surface. It was a sight she had dreamed of for years, and yet, as beautiful as it was, Lyra knew the road ahead remained long and uncertain. The Atlantean Restoration Initiative had become more than just a symbol of hope. It had transformed into a global movement, and the evidence of its success was undeniable. Cities and nations were beginning to embrace sustainability, and ecosystems were being restored. But with this progress came new challenges. As more regions began to adopt the principles of Atlantis, the forces that had once fought against change were regrouping, finding new ways to maintain their hold over the world's resources. The global response to the initiative was overwhelmingly positive, but the corporate giants, the industries that thrived on the exploitation of the earth, had not disappeared. They were no longer able to directly sabotage the project as they once had, but they were adapting, looking for ways to profit from the new systems without truly committing to the changes that were necessary for lasting sustainability. Lyra had learned that true transformation would require not just new policies and technologies, but a fundamental shift in values. It wasn't enough to restore the reefs and forests if humanity didn't fully embrace the lesson of balance. The very lesson that had caused Atlantis's fall centuries ago. She realized that the fight for sustainability was not only about the environment. It was about changing the way people viewed their relationship with the planet and with each other. To that end, Lyra and the leaders of the movement began organizing a global summit, a gathering of world leaders, environmentalists, scientists, and activists, to address the next phase of the initiative. The summit would focus on creating a new global framework, one that integrated the knowledge of Atlantis into every facet of society, from education to commerce, to create a truly sustainable world. They needed to make it clear that this was not just a trend, but the future of humanity. As the summit approached, Lyra felt both excitement and anxiety. This was the moment to solidify the progress that had been made, to ensure that the wisdom of Atlantis wasn't relegated to the fringes of society, but was embraced as the foundation of a new world order. The path to a balanced future was being forged, but it would require unprecedented collaboration and, above all, the willingness of all people to put the planet's well-being before their own short-term interests. The summit, held in a city at the heart of a rapidly growing global economy, drew attention from all over the world. Representatives from every continent came together, united by a shared vision of a more balanced future. In the opening address, Lyra spoke not as a leader, but as a representative of all those who had fought for this moment. The scientists, the activists, the everyday people who had dedicated their lives to creating a world that could sustain future generations. "This is not just about us," she said, her voice steady and unwavering. "This is about the future of the Earth. We are the stewards of this planet, and we have the knowledge, the tools, and the wisdom to restore it. Atlantis showed us the path, and now it's up to us to walk it." The summit was an emotional and historic occasion. The world had come together in a way it never had before, united not by political lines or national borders, but by the shared understanding that the Earth's survival was in their hands. The commitments made at the summit were unprecedented. Agreements to scale the restoration of ecosystems, to invest in renewable energy, and to integrate sustainable practices into all industries. But even as the agreements were signed, Lyra knew that the real work was only just beginning. The challenges would grow more complex as the movement continued to grow. Not everyone was ready to accept the new reality, and the systems of exploitation would not give up easily. But now there was a global coalition of individuals, communities, and nations determined to see the vision through. As the summit concluded, Lyra walked away from the event with a sense of cautious optimism. She had seen the world come together, and that gave her hope. The road ahead would not be without obstacles, but the momentum was now on their side. The wisdom of Atlantis, once thought lost forever, had found its place in the world once more. And this time, humanity was ready to listen. Standing once again by the shores of the revitalized reef, Lyra felt a quiet confidence. The balance had begun, and the world was starting to shift. Though the journey was far from complete, Lyra knew that they had turned a corner. The future of the planet, of humanity, was no longer a question of if, but of when. And with that certainty in her heart, she turned toward the horizon, ready for whatever came next. The world had taken its first real steps toward a future of balance and sustainability. But Lyra knew that the path was fragile. The agreements made at the summit, while groundbreaking, were just the beginning. There were still powerful forces at play, forces that would stop at nothing to protect their grip on the world's resources. In the months following the summit, it became clear that the corporate and political forces resisting the change had not been silenced. They had learned to adapt, to fight back with subtlety. The media campaigns to discredit the Atlantean Restoration Initiative continued, this time focusing on the economic implications. Job losses, they argued, the destruction of industries that power our cities. They painted the movement as a naive dream, insisting that sustainability was simply not feasible on a global scale. But the resistance was no longer confined to the media. Lyra and the leaders of the movement began receiving reports of direct sabotage to the restoration projects. Equipment in some regions was damaged. New policies designed to protect the environment were being blocked in certain governments. The sabotage wasn't just physical, it was financial. Major industries were quietly funding political candidates who opposed the green transition, pushing policies that would undermine years of progress. The worst came when a large-scale multinational corporation, one of the most powerful in the world, launched a campaign against the very principles that Atlantis's wisdom had inspired. Their lobbyists pushed back hard, arguing that the new world order was impractical and would destroy the global economy. Their influence in the halls of power was vast. It felt like a coordinated effort to choke out the movement before it could reach critical mass. Lyra stood on the balcony of her office, overlooking the same city where the summit had taken place. The skyline was filled with the shimmer of glass and steel, the physical manifestations of the power that resisted change. The very systems they were fighting against seemed to rise before her, towering over everything they had worked for. Maeve entered the room, her expression grim. "They're tightening their grip," she said quietly, "and they've got the support of key players in government and media. We can't afford to just be reactive anymore." Lyra nodded. "We knew this was coming. They won't back down easily. They've seen the power of this movement and they'll do everything in their power to stop it, but we can't let them win." There was a quiet urgency in Lyra's voice. She had seen firsthand the fragility of what they had built. The resistance was not just trying to stop the projects, it was trying to turn back the clock, to erase the possibility of a sustainable future. Maeve sat down beside her. "What do we do now?" "We take the fight to them," Lyra replied, her eyes hardened with resolve. "We need to expose their tactics. We need to show the world that they are not fighting for the future. They are fighting for their profits. We can't afford to be polite anymore. The truth is our strongest weapon." The next days were filled with strategy meetings and preparations. Lyra and her team understood that they needed to shift the narrative. They needed to show the world that the corporate resistance was not just protecting jobs, it was protecting a system of exploitation that was destroying the planet. The movement had to go on the offensive, using the very tools the corporations had once used to divide and conquer: media, social influence, and grassroots mobilization. They launched a global campaign, one that exposed the truth behind the corporate resistance. They revealed the funding behind the smear campaigns and sabotage efforts. The initiative included documentaries, investigative reports, and live forums where leaders from the movement could speak directly to the people, showing the progress made by the restoration projects and the real-world benefits of sustainability. It was a battle of information and influence, and Lyra was ready to fight it. She knew the stakes were higher than ever before, but she also knew that the movement had already proven that the wisdom of Atlantis could work. The results spoke for themselves. The people who had experienced the restoration firsthand were speaking out, demanding the continued success of the initiative. But just as the movement gained momentum, the final blow came. A major corporate-backed government official who had long opposed the initiative used their influence to block the funding for the next phase of the restoration project. It was a blow to the movement, but it wasn't the end. It was a turning point. Lyra understood what this moment meant. The resistance was no longer just fighting for control over resources. They were fighting to maintain a world built on extraction and exploitation, and they had chosen their last stand. The battle for the future, she knew, would now be won or lost. Standing in the heart of the movement's headquarters, surrounded by those who had dedicated everything to this cause, Lyra felt a quiet certainty settle in her chest. They had already come too far to turn back. "The truth is on our side," she said, meeting the eyes of each person in the room. "And we will not stop. Not now. Not ever. The fight for balance, for the future of humanity and the planet, had reached its peak. Lyra and the movement were ready. The world had a choice to make, and now, more than ever, it would be up to the people to determine whether they would fight for a sustainable future or fall back into the traps of the past. The final battle for the world's future had begun. The battle for the future had reached a tipping point. Lyra felt the weight of every decision she had made, the countless hours spent organizing, strategizing, speaking, and fighting for the future of the Earth. The Atlantean Restoration Initiative had become a symbol of hope, but it was now under threat like never before. The forces resisting change were no longer just in the shadows. They had revealed themselves fully, using every weapon at their disposal to protect the old world order. Lyra stood at the heart of the movement, more determined than ever, but the path forward was more uncertain than it had ever been. The latest government actions, blocking funding for the restoration project and silencing advocates for change, felt like a direct assault on everything they had fought for. Yet even in the face of these setbacks, the movement had found its strength. Across the globe, the people had begun to rally. Activists, scientists, everyday citizens, those who'd been fighting in smaller, quieter ways, were now coming together, united by a common cause. The fight was no longer just about restoring ecosystems. It had become a fight for the soul of the planet, a fight to protect the future of all its inhabitants. Lyra addressed the gathered leaders and activists in a crowded meeting hall, her voice calm but fierce. "The resistance we face is powerful, but it's also a sign that we are winning. The forces against us can no longer ignore the truth that we are showing. The old world is crumbling, and they are trying to hold it up at any cost. But we have the power to choose the future." The room erupted into applause, but Lyra knew that the applause meant little without action. The resistance was digging in its heels, and it was clear that the battle was not just going to be won in the media or through peaceful protests. It would take all-out mobilization, a coordinated effort to shift the narrative and put pressure on the world's leaders to stand on the right side of history. The movement's next step was decisive. Lyra and Maeve, along with other key leaders, decided to launch a series of international protests, petitions, and direct actions that would put global pressure on governments and corporations. The goal was simple: expose the true motivations behind the resistance, show the people that they were being lied to, and force their leaders to act in favor of the planet, not the few who were clinging to old systems of exploitation. As the protests began to spread, more and more people took to the streets. Social media flooded with images and stories from communities that had embraced the Atlantean way, showing the tangible results of sustainability and collaboration. The public outcry grew and the momentum shifted. In the days that followed, Lyra received word that some of the key officials who had previously opposed the initiative were beginning to reconsider their positions. The pressure from the streets, from the media, and from the people was becoming too great to ignore. Governments were being forced to take action. But even as progress seemed within reach, Lyra knew there was more work to be done. She needed to keep the movement united, to keep the people motivated, even when the fight seemed endless. The forces of resistance were powerful, but they were also afraid. They were afraid of the future the people were creating, a future where the wisdom of Atlantis was no longer a dream, but a living reality. "This is our moment," Lyra said in one of her final speeches before the next round of international actions. "We are standing at a crossroads. The future is before us, and we are the ones who will decide what comes next. The question isn't whether we can create a new world. It's whether we will have the courage to take the necessary steps to make it happen." The final phase of the struggle had begun. Lyra knew that the movement couldn't stop now. The tide of change had shifted, but it still needed to be carried forward with all the energy, passion, and determination that the movement had generated. The battle for the future of the planet would be hard fought, but Lyra was certain of one thing: the spirit of Atlantis would guide them through. The momentum of the movement was palpable now. Everywhere Lyra went, she saw the results of the global awakening that had begun. The protests, the petitions, and the relentless pressure from citizens had forced governments to finally take the Atlantean Restoration Initiative seriously. The opposition was still fierce, but there was a sense of urgency among the leaders who had once been reluctant. They now understood that the future of the planet was at stake. Lyra stood on a platform in a crowded city square, surrounded by people from all walks of life: activists, scientists, families, and workers. They had come from all over the world, united in a common cause. Their faces were determined, their eyes full of hope. This was the final push. It was no longer just about policy changes. It was about proving that the world would not go backward, that humanity had learned its lesson from the fall of Atlantis. Her voice rang out steady and powerful as she addressed the crowd. "We stand at the crossroads of history. The choice we make today will determine the world our children inherit. We can no longer afford to turn a blind eye to the damage we've done to our planet, but we are not here to just mourn the mistakes of the past. We are here to rebuild, to heal, and to create a future in which humanity lives in harmony with the earth." The crowd cheered, the sound reverberating through the streets. But Lyra knew that this was only the beginning of the hardest part. The opposition, though weakened, had not been defeated. Corporate interests and political leaders still controlled vast resources and held immense power. Lyra's plan was to put pressure on them, to expose their true motives, and to rally the people for a final, decisive victory. Over the following weeks, the protests grew larger. Media coverage of the restoration efforts was now everywhere. The successes in restoring ecosystems, the evidence of cleaner air, healthier oceans, and thriving wildlife were undeniable. Every day, more people joined the cause. The opposition tried to counteract with misinformation campaigns, but their influence was waning. People were waking up to the truth. They had been sold a lie, and they had the power to change the narrative. As world leaders convened for the final round of negotiations, Lyra, Maeve, and the leaders of the movement prepared for the most critical meeting yet. This would be their chance to secure a lasting commitment to the Atlantean way. They had already garnered unprecedented support from grassroots organizations and everyday people, but they needed the political backing to make the changes permanent. The summit was tense. Leaders from the world's largest economies stood on one side, their faces stoic and calculating. On the other, Lyra, Maeve, and a diverse group of environmental leaders and scientists stood united. The battle for the future was happening here, in this room. As the talks began, the resistance tried one last time to derail the initiative. Powerful lobbying groups attempted to spin the narrative, to create doubt. But the pressure from the global populace was too great. Countries began to stand up one after another, pledging to fully commit to sustainability. to end fossil fuel subsidies, to invest in renewable energy, and to support large-scale restoration projects across the globe. Lyra felt the tide of change shift in the room. The vision of Atlantis, not as a relic of the past, but as a guiding philosophy for the future, was beginning to take shape in the policies of the world. The victory was within reach. This is not just about saving the planet, Lyra said as the final vote was cast. It's about saving ourselves. It's about creating a world where we can live in balance with nature, where our actions honor the earth and future generations. When the votes were counted, the initiative passed. The world had committed to the Atlantean way. The global restoration movement, once a dream, was now a reality. It was a monumental victory, not just for the movement, but for the future of humanity and the planet. As Lyra stood on the stage, looking out at the cheering crowd, she felt a sense of relief, mixed with exhaustion. The fight was far from over. There would be more challenges, more resistance, and more work to do, but the course had been set. The spirit of Atlantis was alive again, and the world had chosen to walk the path of balance and sustainability. And for the first time, Lyra truly believed that humanity could avoid the mistakes of the past and create a future where both the Earth and its people could thrive. The world had changed. The agreement forged at the summit, the hard-won victory, marked the beginning of a new era, one in which the wisdom of Atlantis, long buried in the annals of history, now served as the guiding light for humanity's future. The Atlantean Restoration Initiative had been accepted as a global mandate, with nations committing to restore ecosystems, adopt sustainable practices, and redesign their economies to prioritize the health of the planet. Lyra stood on a balcony, overlooking the bustling city that had become the epicenter of the movement. Below her, people went about their lives, but now there was a new energy in the air, an energy of hope, of possibility. The towering skyscrapers that had once been symbols of unchecked progress were now being integrated with green roofs, solar panels, and vertical gardens. Public transportation was cleaner, more efficient, and powered by renewable energy. The city had been transformed, but it was just one example of a much larger global shift. She took a deep breath, feeling a quiet sense of accomplishment wash over her. The summit, the protests, the grassroots movements, everything had led to this moment. The collective will of the people had triumphed, but there was still so much to be done. The future had been set on a new course, but now it was time to see if the world could truly embrace the changes needed to sustain it. Maeve entered the room, her face reflecting the same mix of satisfaction and concern. "It's happening," she said softly, looking out at the city. "The projects are starting to roll out. We've got governments on board. The corporations have begun to adapt, or at least pretend to." Lyra nodded. "It's a start, but we can't let them just pretend. We need to make sure the transformation is real, not just cosmetic. The old systems will fight back as soon as they feel threatened again." Maeve smiled faintly. "I think they already know they've lost. It's just a matter of how long it takes for them to accept it." Lyra appreciated Maeve's optimism, but she couldn't shake the feeling that the true test was still to come. She had seen firsthand how entrenched interests could rally in unexpected ways. The changes they had fought for were groundbreaking, but they would need continued vigilance, pressure, and innovation to ensure they took root deeply in the fabric of society. The restoration projects across the globe were seeing results. Coral reefs, once dying, were now showing signs of recovery. Forests, stripped bare by years of deforestation, were slowly regrowing. The air in cities had cleared, and cleaner energy was being adopted on an unprecedented scale. But the people, those who had fought for this new world, knew that every step forward was fragile, that the forces of greed and unchecked ambition could rear their heads at any moment. Lyra had already begun preparations for the next phase of the movement, education. The future of the world didn't just lie in policy, technology, or international agreements. It lay in the hearts and minds of people in future generations who would grow up knowing that balance with nature was not just an ideal, but a necessity for survival. She met with educators, activists, and philosophers who'd been instrumental in the movement's success, brainstorming ways to make the teachings of Atlantis, its lessons on sustainability, community, and harmony, part of the global curriculum. If the future was to be truly different, it had to be embedded in the hearts of the youth. As Lyra stood at the head of the meeting table, surrounded by passionate individuals, she realized how far they had come. There was still much work to be done, and the world had many challenges ahead. But for the first time, she allowed herself to truly believe in the future. The changes they had set in motion were real. The lessons of Atlantis, its wisdom, its vision, were alive again. Humanity was no longer heading down a path of destruction. They were on the cusp of creating a world that honored the earth, and in doing so, honored themselves. Lyra walked back to the balcony, looking out over the transformed city. The sun was setting, casting long shadows across the streets. It was a new dawn, not just for this city, but for the world. And for the first time in a long while, Lyra felt a deep sense of peace. The fight was far from over, but the world had chosen a new direction. The journey had begun, and she would be there every step of the way to ensure that humanity stayed on the path of balance, harmony, and wisdom. The world was changing, and Lyra felt it in every corner of the cities, in the air, in the hearts of the people. The transformation they had fought for was not only a reality, it was becoming ingrained in the fabric of global society. The Atlantean way was no longer just a movement. It had become a model for living, a guiding principle for the generations to come. The projects that had begun as small-scale restoration efforts were now widespread. The revitalization of ecosystems was no longer a distant dream, but an ongoing process across the globe. Urban centers, once symbols of overconsumption and environmental disregard, were now models of sustainability, with green spaces thriving in places once dominated by concrete. Renewable energy had replaced fossil fuels in cities, and the principles of circular economies were taking root in industries that had once been wasteful. Lyra stood on a stage at an international conference, surrounded by representatives from all walks of life, scientists, environmentalists, young activists, and political leaders. The gathering was a celebration of the progress made and the challenges ahead. It had been a long journey, but the collective will of humanity was driving them forward. Today, Lyra began, her voice steady but filled with emotion, we stand on the shoulders of those who came before us, the activists, the dreamers, the fighters who never gave up. We stand here because we listened to the lessons of the past. Atlantis, with all its glory and flaws, has taught us that power, when wielded without respect for balance, leads only to destruction. But when knowledge is used to nurture the earth, it can lead to a future we can all share. The room erupted into applause, but Lyra knew that this was just the beginning. The work of restoring the world's ecosystems, creating a sustainable global economy, and educating the next generation of leaders was far from finished. They had set the wheels of change in motion, but it would take time for this new world to fully take root. One of the greatest challenges lay in ensuring that the legacy of Atlantis didn't fade, that the wisdom of the past didn't become just another forgotten tale. The knowledge they had rediscovered needed to be passed down, not just through policy, but through the stories they told, the way they taught, and the values they instilled in their children. Lyra knew that to truly build a sustainable future, they needed to make the teachings of Atlantis part of every person's life. She worked with educators, philosophers, and visionaries to create programs and curricula that would teach future generations the importance of balance, sustainability, and respect for the earth. In every classroom, children began to learn the principles of ecological stewardship, social harmony, and the importance of respecting nature. In communities, people gathered to discuss how their lives could reflect the ideals of Atlantis, not as an ancient city to be admired from afar, but as a living, breathing model for how to live in harmony with the world. But even as the movement spread, Lyra knew that they were not out of danger. The forces of resistance, though weakened, still held power in some corners of the world. There were still industries pushing back, still leaders who clung to old ways of thinking. The work of ensuring that the Atlantean way became a permanent part of society was ongoing, and Lyra could feel the weight of the responsibility pressing on her shoulders. Yet as she looked out over the world that was slowly but surely shifting, she felt a deep sense of hope. She had spent years working to ignite this change, and though it had been difficult, the world was beginning to heal. The lessons of Atlantis, of humility, balance, and interconnectedness, were finding their way into every corner of the globe. And as she looked toward the horizon, Lyra knew that the world had made its choice. It was choosing balance over excess, sustainability over exploitation, and wisdom over unchecked ambition. Atlantis, once lost beneath the waves, had risen again, not as a forgotten myth, but as a guiding light for a brighter future. The legacy of Atlantis would endure, not as a distant memory, but as a living, breathing force that would guide humanity for generations to come. And Lyra, who had fought for this moment, could finally allow herself to believe that the world was on the path to a new, balanced tomorrow. If you liked this story about the struggle for the future of our planet, please support us. Share your opinion in the comments. What does the principle of balance mean to you, and how do you think we can use the knowledge of the past to build a better future? Don't forget to like and subscribe so that you don't miss new inspiring stories about how we can change the world.